Under the harsh glare of the courtroom's fluorescent lights, a tension as palpable as a drawn bowstring filled the air. They had all written him off, a man dismissed, ridiculed, treated like a pawn unworthy of serious consideration, until his every word unraveled a scheme of legal trickery right before their very eyes. Jared Calloway, a figure more defined by his steely resolve than by his modest attire, a suit showing signs of long use and a tie that leaned ever so slightly askew, stepped forward. He wasn't a polished litigator or a seasoned barrister, he was simply a son determined to protect his grandmother's legacy from the crushing gears of a corporate juggernaut that viewed human lives as nothing more than digits on a balance sheet. His silent defiance vibrated in the charged air, a promise that fate would soon turn in his favor. High above the murmurs of disbelief, Judge Walter Grayson peered over his spectacles. His lips twitched into a half-smile, a blend of amusement and incredulity, before he reclined in his chair, his gavel tapping a measured cadence that echoed like a metronome heralding the start of an unfolding drama. "Self-representation, Mr. Calloway," he drawled, his tone laced with a condescending levity that barely concealed his skepticism. Jared met the judge's gaze with an unwavering nod, as if to say, "Yes, Your Honor," his quiet confidence resonating against the room's oppressive cynicism. Somewhere amid the polished leather and marble, the very air seemed to quiver with anticipation. On the opposing side, Bryce Sterling, a litigator whose presence exuded the assured swagger of a corporate bulldog, adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate precision. His every gesture declared this courtroom as his personal arena, a domain where he had trampled over countless little men like Jared without a second thought. Sterling's eyes sparkled with the smug satisfaction of a predator confident of its kill, muttering under his breath, "This will be over quickly," to an assistant whose knowing smile confirmed the inevitability of his victory. Jared, however, had long ago learned the sting of being underestimated. Dismissal was his constant companion, and it was precisely that scorn which had driven him to this very moment. A weary sigh escaped Judge Grayson as he shuffled through a thick file. "This dispute," he intoned, "concerns a property and, correct, a foreclosure challenge." Jared's nod was brisk and resolute. "My grandmother's home," he affirmed, his voice cutting through the courtroom's stillness. The judge barely spared him a glance. "And you truly believe you can contest this matter before someone as experienced as Mr. Sterling?" The query dripped with incredulity. Yet Jared's reply was unflinching. "I don't believe, I know." His words, calm yet defiant, rippled through the room. A ripple of barely suppressed chuckles erupted from the corporate contingent, but underneath their amusement lay a deeper, unspoken tension, the kind of silence that grips a room when an unlikely challenger refuses to retreat. Judge Grayson shook his head and, with an air of resigned formality, declared, "Very well. Let us proceed." But Jared was not merely here to raise arguments, he was here to triumph, and no one in that courtroom had any inkling of the storm he was about to unleash. The judge's doubt was just the opening act. The real contest was about to be waged by the very man seated opposite him, a man who assumed Jared's fate was sealed before a single word had been spoken. With an air of rehearsed nonchalance, Bryce Sterling adjusted his tie once more, his lips curling into a smug smile. "This courtroom," he thought, "is my kingdom. Here, the rules bend to my will. I've crushed scores of challengers like Jared Calloway, a man with no law degree, no firm behind him, no polished resume. Today isn't a battle, it's merely a warm-up." Judge Grayson exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as he addressed Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, you may begin your opening statement." Rising with a practiced flourish, Sterling buttoned his jacket and advanced toward the jury. His voice, smooth and confident as silk, cascaded over the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, this matter is straightforward," he declared, motioning casually in the direction of Jared without so much as a glance. "We have before us a man who obstinately refuses to embrace reality. The property in dispute was acquired, through proper, lawful foreclosure, by my client. The law stands immutable, the facts are unassailable. This case is not driven by emotion but by contracts, deadlines, and obligations. My client followed every legal protocol." A pregnant pause followed, as if the courtroom itself held its breath. Then, with a slow, almost dismissive turn and a casual shrug, Jared's retort came, "I sympathize. Losing a home is a tragedy. But suffering does not nullify legal responsibility. The numbers don't lie." He nodded once toward the judge, then resumed his seat with his arms folded, a silent declaration that the contest was far from over. Even as he did so, he caught the subtle shift in Judge Grayson's posture, a backward lean, arms crossed, as though the judge were quietly scrutinizing an underdog defiant enough to force his hand. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," Jared's voice was steady as he cleared his throat, "Mr. Sterling is correct on one point, the law is clear. The question is, does his client abide by it?" A flicker of irritation danced across Sterling's face at that challenge. Undeterred, Jared pressed on. "For the past 6 months, I've pored over every case, every statute, every loophole that banks and corporate giants exploit to wrench homes from families. And I discovered something that changes everything." Judge Grayson's eyebrows arched in intrigue. Jared's steady nod invited him to continue. "Before I proceed, Your Honor, I must formally request discovery, for I have substantial reason to suspect that the plaintiff conceals crucial evidence." At that moment, the murmur of the courtroom shifted. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his expression darkening from mere amusement to something far sterner, an unspoken acknowledgement that Jared's words were no idle threat. His gaze locked onto the corporate figure of Sterling, and the word fraud seemed to hang in the air like a slow-burning fuse. Sterling's smug demeanor faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease, while the judge regarded Jared with a newfound intensity. "Fraud," the judge echoed, his tone mixing skepticism with a spark of curiosity. Jared nodded once more, his voice firm, "Yes, Your Honor. I believe that the foreclosure on my grandmother's home was executed with forged documents, and I can prove it, if granted full discovery." Sterling's breath caught, and he shook his head with an exasperated sigh. "Your Honor, this is preposterous, a baseless attempt to delay the inevitable. The property was seized following standard foreclosure procedures." Jared tilted his head, stepping forward. "Standard?" he challenged. "Tell me, Mr. Sterling, how typical is it for a bank to foreclose on a property when the original mortgage carries not one, but 2 distinct signatures from the same individual?" A ripple of murmurs stirred among the gallery. Sterling's jaw clenched visibly. "What exactly are you implying?" he demanded. Without missing a beat, Jared retrieved a folder and produced 2 copies of the original mortgage agreement. With deliberate calm, he handed them to the bailiff, and soon the judge was leafing through the documents. "Your Honor, observe, one is from the initial filing, and the other from a later modification. Notice the signatures, they do not match." Judge Grayson leaned in, his forehead creasing as he scrutinized the papers. "I'm no expert," Jared continued, "but I know my grandmother's signature. That second signature, it isn't hers." The judge's demeanor shifted from dismissiveness to focused inquiry as he fixed his gaze on Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, can you explain this discrepancy?" Sterling cleared his throat, his voice strained. "Your Honor, this is merely an effort to obfuscate the matter. Signatures, after all, can evolve over time." "Perhaps," Jared countered, "but consider this, that second signature appears on a document filed a mere 3 months after the original. And if you compare them side by side, you'll see they differ not only in form but in timing. The second was signed just 1 day after my grandmother's hospitalization for a stroke." A hush fell over the courtroom, the tension mounting as even the jury leaned forward in anticipation. Judge Grayson's tone sharpened as he turned back to Sterling. "Tell me, Mr. Sterling, does your client have the original, signed documents on file?" Sterling's hesitation was fleeting, yet it did not escape Jared's keen observation, nor that of the judge. "We would require time to retrieve them, Your Honor," he stammered. A small smile tugged at Jared's lips. "That's perfectly acceptable, I'll wait." The atmosphere had transformed, it was no longer merely curiosity but a deep-seated doubt that began to gnaw at the foundations of Sterling's case. Jared's next words cut through the mounting silence. "Mr. Sterling, do you even know from whom your client acquired this debt?" Sterling's eyes blinked in surprise. "What does that have to do with this case?" Jared turned, addressing the judge directly. "Your Honor, this mortgage was sold 3 times before arriving at its current holder. 3 distinct transfers, but the accompanying paperwork, the endorsements that should have accompanied each handover, tell a different story." He paused, retrieving another document from his folder and handing it over to the bailiff. "Examine this closely," he urged. "Every time the loan changed hands, it should have been accompanied by an official transfer endorsement. Yet on the last transfer, notice the absence of any signature." Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Judge Grayson's brows knit together in concentration. "So you're saying," the judge prompted, "that the final entity had no legal authority to foreclose on your grandmother's home, and that the bank executing the foreclosure never truly owned the loan?" A hushed murmur coursed through the room, the tension thickening like a gathering storm. Sterling's voice tightened as he attempted to regain control. "Your Honor, this is..." Judge Grayson cut him off decisively. "This is a serious matter, Mr. Calloway." Jared inhaled slowly, savoring the moment of advantage. They had underestimated him, they had laughed at him, but now, their derision had turned to dread. Exposing the fraud was one battle, proving malicious intent was another, and Jared was just about to unleash his most potent salvo. Sterling's confident mask began to crack. The once assured man, who had treated this case as a mere formality, now fumbled for a foothold. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his voice razor-sharp. "Mr. Sterling, surely your client can account for why this mortgage was transferred without the requisite endorsement?" Sterling's reply came hesitantly, "Your Honor, I would need to confer with my client before offering any explanation." Jared's eyes narrowed. "So, you mean the same client who has repeatedly submitted documents of questionable legality in multiple foreclosure cases?" Sterling's retort was swift and accusatory, "That is a baseless allegation." Unflinching, Jared pressed on, "Is it because I've taken the liberty of examining your client's foreclosure history? It turns out my grandmother's property isn't the sole victim of these irregularities." Another document slid into the judge's hands, and the weight of evidence began to shift. Judge Grayson's expression darkened as he scanned the new papers. "This case is not as simple as you suggested," he murmured. Before Sterling could muster a reply, Jared's voice rang out once more, "Your Honor, I call a witness." The courtroom erupted in whispers. "A witness?" the judge echoed. "Yes, the very notary who affixed the controversial signature on the second mortgage modification," Jared declared, his tone both measured and defiant. A collective gasp swept through the gallery as it became evident that the stakes had just been raised beyond mere technicalities. Instantly, Sterling protested, rising abruptly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This witness was not disclosed beforehand." Jared met his challenge calmly. "That is because I only located her yesterday, and what she revealed changes everything." After a pregnant pause that stretched the silence taut, Judge Grayson fixed his gaze on Sterling before finally saying, "I'm allowing it." Sterling stiffened, his confidence was waning rapidly, and he knew the tide was turning. At that precise moment, the heavy oak door creaked open at the back of the courtroom. A woman entered, her posture tense, her eyes reflecting the burden of untold truths. Linda Myers, a notary public with a reputation for meticulous record-keeping, ascended the steps to the witness stand. She adjusted her glasses and gripped the railing as if steadying herself for what lay ahead. Judge Grayson gestured for her to state her name and occupation for the record. "Linda Myers, licensed notary public," she announced, her voice soft but clear. Jared leaned forward. "Miss Myers, do you recall notarizing the second mortgage modification for my grandmother, Alma Calloway?" Her gaze flickered toward Sterling, and after a brief pause, she nodded uncertainly. "Were you present when she signed the document?" Jared asked. Another beat of silence passed before Linda's discomfort yielded a hesitant, "No, I was not present." A ripple of astonishment surged through the courtroom. "Miss Myers," Jared pressed gently, "did you witness anyone else signing on her behalf?" Her voice, barely more than a whisper, answered. No. Stepping closer, Jared inquired, "Then how did the document become notarized?" Her hands trembled as she confessed, "I was handed the paperwork by a bank representative. I was told it had already been signed, and my only task was to affix my stamp." The revelation crashed over the courtroom like a tidal wave, the admission that the notarization process was compromised, rendering the entire foreclosure procedure legally flawed. An immediate objection from Sterling was cut short by Judge Grayson's raised hand. "Overruled," he declared firmly. Turning back to Linda, he asked, "Do you understand the legal implications of your statement?" Linda's glassy eyes met his, and in a voice heavy with regret, she admitted, "I did not know at the time, but I should have." Sterling slumped back in his seat, the evidence of his defeat now inescapable. Jared then addressed the court with quiet finality, "Given this testimony, the forged signature, and the missing mortgage transfer endorsements, I move that this foreclosure be nullified. My grandmother's home was seized through fraudulent means, and the evidence stands indisputable before you." For a moment, silence reigned. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel slowly, each strike resonating with finality. "The court rules in favor of the defendant. The foreclosure is hereby declared void, and the property shall be returned immediately." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Jared allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph. He had held his ground, his months of exhaustive research culminating in this very moment. As he locked eyes with Sterling, whose once confident stare had dissolved into a hollow, defeated gaze, Jared felt no vindictive satisfaction. This battle was never about personal revenge, it was about ensuring that justice, however long in coming, ultimately prevailed. His grandmother's home would remain her sanctuary, untaken, unassailable, and forever honored. Later, stepping out onto the courthouse steps beneath the late afternoon sun, Jared paused as long shadows stretched across the stone. The air was different now, heavier with reality rather than lightened by a fleeting sense of freedom. In that quiet moment, the true weight of his victory settled over him. Behind him, murmurs arose, some whispered about the case's astonishing twists, others speculated about the unlikely hero who had dared to challenge the mighty. Comments flew, never saw it coming, and that man should be a lawyer. Yet Jared needed no validation, what mattered was that justice had been served. A voice called from behind, and Jared turned to see Judge Grayson standing at the top of the courthouse steps, his hands tucked casually in his pockets. The earlier condescension had melted away, replaced by a measured tone. "You surprised me in there," the judge said, his voice neither warm nor cold but balanced by quiet respect. Jared met his gaze steadily. "You weren't the only one," he replied softly. After a lingering moment of silent appraisal, Judge Grayson asked, "Have you ever thought about law school?" Jared chuckled quietly. "Not really," he admitted. The judge's lips quirked into a fleeting smirk. "Perhaps you should reconsider, you have a knack for making people squirm." With that, the judge turned and melted back into the building, leaving Jared to contemplate his unexpected future. As he exhaled deeply, shaking his head at the notion of law school or not, one truth remained unchallenged: when someone dares to defend what is rightfully theirs, they must be prepared for the fight. Power isn't reserved for those with money or prestigious titles, it belongs to those who refuse to back down, who challenge injustice with relentless determination. And as Jared Calloway had proven, the underestimated not only have everything to prove, they can, when given the chance, change the world.